Hi everyone and welcome to Isamu Rat Care. So today's video is going to be all about the kind of science behind rats losing heat. So it's kind of hot weather, you want your rats to be cooler, and I've done a few little videos now that have just been little kind of easy ideas that you can use to help keep them cool. But this is all about understanding it at a kind of more in-depth level and using that actually to come up with different strategies. So the ones that I've done in my short videos are just some short little ideas. This is kind of going to cover a few more ideas, but actually why they work, and that will help you come up with your own ideas, which would be really good to see actually and really good to share. So how do rats lose heat? I think the first thing to mention, just grabbing me a rat to demonstrate, is rats don't sweat. So one of the #1 ways we as humans use to kind of lose heat is by sweating, and that causes evaporation, means we can lose heat, which is great. Rats can't do that, much like dogs actually, so they have to lose heat in different ways, and they're physically set up to not be out in really hot weather. If you think about it, wild rats will go in burrows, and they'll be in those burrows during the day when it's really hot. Our pet rats are generally kept in cages or hutches or similar, but well above ground, and generally is cooler down underneath the ground. So they then struggle a little bit to kind of maintain that heat, even if they're not doing very much, even if they're in a fairly dark place. As the temperature gets up, they've got to try and manage their own heat somehow. So how do they do that? Berko decided he wanted to go for a walk, so I've now got another rat. So if we have a quick look at the rat, the main ways that they lose heat, you'll notice, obviously, rats have a nice thick covering of fur. This is great when it's cold, and this is why generally rats deal with the cold better than the heat. It insulates them, traps air in there, keeps them nice and warm in kind of cold weather. But what it doesn't do is let them lose heat through anything that's got fur on it. So that means the majority of their body they can't lose heat through. So what they do use is their ears, and you'll notice actually, I don't know if you'll be able to see particularly well on her ears here, but as your rats get warmer, and I will say it's not that hot here today, it's cooled down thankfully, but as they get warmer their ears get pinker. This is sometimes called pinking up. This is the veins and arteries in the ear kind of getting larger to help them lose heat, because they do lose heat through their ears, as Chocobo shows with her lovely big Dumbo ears. The other areas they lose heat through is their tail. Again, it's virtually got no fur in it, so it's a lot less insulated. They can lose heat through that, and they lose heat through the soles of their feet. And again, no fur on there, great way of kind of transmitting heat to the surfaces around them. So those are the kind of 3 key areas on rats where they're naturally able to lose heat. They can lose some heat through the fur, but obviously it's going to be a lot less effective because of this nice little thick warm jacket that's keeping them so kind of cosy in a bad way sometimes. So what are we going to have to think about when we're trying to encourage rats to lose heat, understanding from their physiology how they're set up to lose heat? So this is back to your kind of science class. I've written some words on here. Hopefully they've been flipped around to the right way around so you can read them, but I'll talk over them anyway. So first of all is convection. So convection is, let's draw a doodle because it'll make it easier. Convection is the act of kind of losing heat through a cycle of heat. So I think this is something you probably all remember, but just in case I'll go over it. So one thing we can say is as hot air rises, goes up into the air, goes higher up, and then it will gradually lose heat, and then you will find it will drop down, the cool air will sink, and that's to do with the different density, and you get this kind of cycle of hot air going up and going warmer at the top, and actually you'll find that in your rooms, the highest point in an area will be warmer than the lowest point. So at in my house, when it's kind of really warm, the loft is an oven. It's horrible, you don't want to be in there. Downstairs is actually quite cool. Some of that's also to do with the roof getting sunlight on it, etc, so it heats up the top part more than the bottom. But it's a general rule of thumb: hot air rises, cool air sinks. Now how is this useful to rats? Because ultimately they can choose where they're going to be in the cage, and my rats, despite it being warmer higher up, like to sleep higher up most of the time. Some of them sleep lower down, but the majority of them would far rather be near the top of the cage, despite it being slightly warmer there. Convection is actually quite useful. You can do things with rats where you rely on this cold air sinking. So the kind of thing you can do is take a simple towel, get it wet, stick it in the freezer for a period of time, or a fridge if you don't have access to a freezer, until it's quite nice and cool, and then drape it over the top of the cage. Now, it doesn't matter if they chew it a bit. This is my rat towel. You can probably see it's been kind of chewed to pieces over the year, so they will chew something that goes on top of the cage, particularly with bars and everything. But the key thing is that the cool air from that frozen towel will start sinking, and that will sink down onto the rats that are sleeping below it, because of this little cycle. And that's a really nice way of kind of adding coolness. If you don't want to use a towel to be chewed, you can freeze a bowl of water, bottle of water, etc. Anything that's cooler than the surrounding air. If you basically put it on top of the cage, the cool air will sink, and that will give them that extra kind of coolness. So that's quite a useful way of using one of the methods of cooling. So next one, conduction. Conduction is the most obvious one. So basically that says when something warmer is in contact with something cooler, pushed up against each other, then the heat will go in the direction of the kind of coolest area. So it's one of these things where nature always seeks balance. So we've got cold here, excuse my handwriting, hot here, and the heat will always go in that direction. Nice and simple. And this is a way that we quite often use to keep our rats cool, and we have to remember, like I was talking about before, what parts of the rats have the kind of best heat transmission. So great way of doing this, and I've got some examples here. They're currently being played with by the rats, so I'm having to remove a few layers of rats to get to them. We've got a big ceramic plate. You can use ceramic tiles, you can use kind of big stones, slate, etc. This is just a plate that I got. It's brilliant because you can also put kind of frozen water in it, etc. But if you freeze this, again, with a bit of water in, it's great. That works really well. The rats can then lie on it, next to it, near it. They'll get effects of it partly from radiation, which we'll come on to later, but also from conduction. So if they're lying on this surface, it's nice and cool, and I put my hand on it in the moment, and I can feel how cool it is, and that's because the heat from my hand is going into this. Eventually it will warm up to the same temperature, but for a good while it will be at a cooler temperature and help the rats cool down. Another option for this, which is something that would cost you money, this is a Snuggle Safe Cool Pod. I recently invested in it. It's technically chew proof, and actually I will say it's been in the rat cage for a while and it's not been chewed through. It's filled with a kind of gel that's quite good at kind of absorbing heat. It seems to last a little bit longer than the frozen kind of plate, but it also costs a fair bit more than just getting a cheap tile or something from a DIY store. I should also mention you could use like terracotta pots and such, as long as they're low down, because they can fall and smash. Do bear that in mind when you're using things. But this is quite nice. I got this in a real big heat wave because I had a couple of, well, a cage full of big bucks staying over, and particularly older bucks. You really worry about them. I should mention this actually. Rats that are most at risk of heat are larger rats. So again, if you go back to your kind of school science lessons, it's all about surface area. So if you think about animals that are typically in cold parts of the world, like polar bears, very big mass, very kind of quite large animals, but they don't have a relatively large surface area. So the larger the animal it is, the smaller overall surface area they've got, the more kind of nice condensed warm stuff inside them. So they keep warm really well, but it also means when it comes to hot weather that a buck like, here he is, a big buck like Burko is going to have much more problem losing heat than a little doe like Foo. He's got a lot more body mass, he's going to struggle because his surface area isn't as big. And when you get an older buck or a particularly overweight fat rat, then these are really in danger from heat stroke. And I should say, heat stroke is bad, it can kill, it can bring on heart attacks, it can cause all sorts of problems. It's one to be really aware of. When you're looking for signs of heat stroke in a rat, their ears will be very bright pink normally, and they will be floppy, lethargic. They may have started drooling. Drooling is a very late stage sign, and that is the rat is very, very sick because they're literally drooling to help cool them down in a way. But because they've got into such a state, it's a very dangerous thing. In fact, I know of more rats that have died from heat stroke than ever from the cold. The cold rarely actually causes a problem. Unless you've got a rat that really can't physically keep itself warm, and that tends to be a very sick rat. So watch your big rats, watch your fat rats, watch your old rats. As with anything, if a rat is not as robust in their immune system, they're going to struggle more. So do keep an eye on them. But yes, it's particularly a big kind of large, bulky rats that have the biggest problems. Right, so back on to, so conduction is great. I did get this to put into kind of an old books cage because I wanted to give them a good long amount of kind of coldness. You can also get a similar kind of thing called ice pod, which you put in a freezer. I find that they don't tend to go near that quite as much because it is quite cold unless you put a towel around it. Whereas this, they can go straight on the surface of, which is quite handy. So that's how you make use of conduction, basically putting in surfaces that are colder, that will stay cold ideally for a decent amount of time, which is why we use things like ceramics and kind of special surfaces, and then let the rats come in contact with it. It's a great way of doing it, and what I tend to find, when I had this in the cage, I had a rat resting its head on it because it wanted to cool down. Much like us, the head has quite a lot of responsibility for cooling. But yes, so they did use it quite well, and it went down very well, as does kind of frozen ceramics. You probably often find them by the end of the day kind of lying on there, but they do get filthy. I had to clean that down twice a day because they just pooed all over it because they're rats. But that's fine, if it keeps them cool, it's worth it. So next one, radiation. So radiation is a nice straightforward thing. It's basically that you've got a kind of cold object here, or actually you've got a hot object. It doesn't really matter. So the hot object will kind of send out heat, and the cold object will actually also kind of pull in heat as such. Well, radiate the coolness, that's probably the easiest way of describing it, but effectively it's just making the air around it cooler. So what we can use this for is if you get something that's very cold and put it in the rat cage, then it will radiate coldness to the surrounding area. And it'll do that as long as it's colder than the surrounding. Again, it's all back to this, nature loves balance. Something that's hot wants to be the same temperature as something that's cold, so they'll come to a temperature that's roughly in the middle if they're equal. So it's a similar thing, it's just where conduction involves direct contact, radiation doesn't need direct contact, it'll do it across air. I will say air's a bit of an insulator, so conduction works better than radiation in a lot of respects, but it's also a perfectly legitimate way of cooling them down. So things I use for this is I quite often freeze bowls of water. You've seen some of my videos where I put a bit of veg in, etc. That works in two ways. If they eat something cold, it works via conduction, so they cool down internally. But also having that frozen bowl in the cage, it's radiating cool air, and you may also get a bit of a convection current going up, some coldness from there will be dropping down, etc. So it's kind of, you'll find that a lot of these things satisfy more than one method of cooling. So we've kind of got this radiation going on from any cold object. You can use all sorts. One thing that I should say, actually, a lot of people, when they're thinking about cooling down rats, get them a fan. And you think, oh, that's fine, that cools me down. That cools me down because I'm sweating. Radiation is kind of sometimes helped by a fan though. So radiation, it will warm the air, or cool the air, sorry, immediately surrounding it. But if you then blow that air away and replace it with new cooler air, then that can work quite well. So using radiation in combination with a fan works. Using a fan on its own doesn't. So the fan circulates the air and basically keeps the air around anything that's cool fresh. So what I quite often do actually, freeze a bottle of water, this currently isn't because it's not that hot, and then I will use, I've got a fan here, and I will literally fasten this water bottle to the fan with a bit of wire, nothing fancy there, and that will then act, somebody decided to walk underneath the base of the fan as I showed you the fan, Moomin is now out of the fan base, but yes, that will then act as kind of a, it would be radiating cool air, and the fan will be blowing the cool air around. So there'll be a little bit of convection going on as well as the radiation, but that works really well. If you're going to use a fan, you can use frozen water bottles. What I also did is I've got a load of camping freezer blocks, and I used some of those as well, and I just basically kept circulating the freezer blocks, bottles of water through the freezer. So there's always a few things, like one thing freezing, one thing frozen, and one thing on the fan that was kind of slowly defrosting, or not that slowly because it was hot. and that kind of kept the air circulating and cool, particularly because whilst my main cage is quite big, there's quite a lot of surface area there for airflow to happen through it. I had holidaying rats over and they were in much smaller cages, Alaskas if you know them, and whilst that's okay for a short term, when it's very hot they form, because they were stacked as well, there was a lot less room for air circulation, so I had the fan pointing at that direction for most of the day, and that was then kind of, with the frozen water bottle, keeping cool air circulating through them. Plus I had a couple of cages of bucks in there, which wasn't particularly pleasant, because they, like I say, are more at risk. So that's using radiation. And the final option is evaporation. Sorry. So this is how we keep cool. So if we sweat, water is on our surface. When water gets hot, it evaporates. When it evaporates, it actually takes a thing off it. So you've got hot surface here. You've got like a little drop of water. And then as that gets hot, that kind of evaporates. These are kind of wiggly arrows, you can't really see this. And then as it evaporates, it actually takes some of the heat off that surface, because it takes heat energy to evaporate. So this is a really good way of surfaces losing water. And actually one of the ways you can help rats do this is via spray. So one of the videos I'll look at a little bit using the water spray. It's kind of like if we spray ourselves, you can immediately feel that it's cool. And that's because the water is starting to evaporate off your arm. Now with rats we have to think about what surfaces they have with the best kind of heat conduction. So they've got their ears, they've got their feet, they've got their tail. So when you're spraying a rat with water, you use the feet, ears, tail. Though I will say, be careful, you don't want to get water down the ears, so try and do it from behind for their ears. I tend to focus on the feet and the tail. So that's quite a useful way of doing it. To be honest, a little bit on the surface of their coat actually will also help. It's if they're quite hot in themselves. You don't want to get them sopping wet, but if you miss them slightly, even on their coat surface, they will lose a little bit of heat through there, through evaporation. So other ways you can make use of that, and currently Chocobo's in it. Here we have it. This is basically an old washing up bowl that I've converted into a rat pool. So they've got this out on free range at the moment. When it's hot weather, I put this in the cage. But they quite enjoy it. Let's put it down. But this basically means that they can choose to get their feet and tail wet when I'm not around to spray them, and they do. As you can see, Chocobo was kind of popping in and out of there. There's nothing in there for her to fish for. Sometimes I will add peas, a bit of veg, etc. to encourage them to get in there. But actually, if they're hot, I think they're usually smart enough to realise that they can go into some water. And if you keep it shallow, if they're not used to water and you can keep it shallow, then that works fine. I wouldn't put something too deep in the cage. For a start, it gets smelly very quickly because being rats, they like to poo in it. And particularly I've got a digging box in the cage, so half the digging box ends up somehow in there, even though it has to go up to get in there. So I do have to change it like every day at least, if not twice a day. But it's a good way of keeping them cool through this evaporation. What I should also mention, actually I missed it on the radiation one, I've got a stack of useful things here that I thought I'd mention, is one of the good ways of radiation is thinking about sleeping mats. If you think about, a lot of rats use hammocks. Hammocks are quite insulating. Fleece, which is used in a lot of hammocks, or even toweling, etc. It was designed to keep us warm when it's cold weather. It was designed to wick moisture away as well, which doesn't really matter for rats because they're not going to sweat, as I say. But effectively it's nice and insulating, it's warm, it's not going to help them lose weight, or lose heat, sorry, to be in that environment. So what you can use is use surfaces that are kind of holy. So you can see this is transparent here, there's lots of gaps. This is just a bamboo kind of placemat. I quite often use them as hammocks in the cages. They don't last long, the rats chew them to pieces quite quickly, but they're also quite cheap. So you can hang this up, rats can then sleep on it, and then there's going to be a nice kind of circulation of air underneath it to help them radiate the heat away. Other options, I use a lot of sackcloth in my cage. Again, it is quite see-through. As you can see, it's quite a loose weave. It's not very insulating, unless I pack it full of hay. And actually I find that the rats are nearly always on one of the kind of sackcloth hammocks when I've got kind of really warm weather. They don't tend to use the fleece stuff, whereas when it's kind of cold, they're straight in the fleece houses, or they're actually in one of these with a lot of hay in it, because that works just as well. This is another one that I got from I think it's Demented Squirrels Hammocks, which is great. This is basically crocheted from a kind of jersey material, but again, nice and holey, let air circulate. You can also get kind of, I'll see if I can find a picture and pop it up on this, but mesh kind of toy hangers, and actually if you cut them down, I used to have them, I don't know where the hell I've put them, I probably had a clear out, but if you use that kind of mesh base, it makes a nice little circular hammock that again they can breathe through really easily. So it's all this kind of allowing air to circulate, encouraging them to get kind of surfaces wet, having cold surfaces available, and so on. If you can do all that, you'll find that the rats generally do okay. Obviously you've still got to keep an eye on what the temperature is. I should also mention that the real danger in temperature, when it becomes more serious, is when you've got sudden changes in temperature. So rats that, well, let's say, it got quite hot in the UK recently. It got to, in my rat room, it got to, I think 28, 29 was the maximum it got to. Some people in other countries watching this video will be laughing and saying, what the hell, it's like that all summer for me. It gets up to 40 degrees here. But the key thing is, my rats are used to the UK temperatures. Over winter it gets down to about 12 in here gradually. What kind of gets them is when it's a lot different temperatures than they're expecting, and this was quite a sudden heat wave as well, so it went from probably around about the early 20s right up to 28 in a matter of a couple of days, so it's quite a shock to the system, to mine as well as theirs. And that's where you get the really danger. So remember, it doesn't actually, the actual temperature doesn't make a huge difference, though obviously the warmer it is, the worse it is for the rats. Where it really matters is where it changes suddenly, when the rats aren't used to it, and also when they're kind of large, overweight, etc. This is where it kind of impacts more, so bear that in mind. So you also don't want to necessarily use something like air conditioning if they're not used to it. So some people do this. You can get air coolers, actually, I should mention. They're a bit different. They cool the air in the same way as my frozen water bottle in front of the fan works. But when you're talking about air conditioners, they're a lot more efficient way of cooling the air, and they can make it quite cold. But the danger in them come most of the time fine, as long as you kind of drop the temperature gradually, so it's not a big shock to their system. But I've come across some cases where the air conditioning units have suddenly failed in the middle of a really hot weather. Maybe they've kind of had a fault, something going on with that, there's been a power cut, and the rats have then suddenly been subjected from being a nice kind of 18 degrees, let's say, whacked straight up to 28 degrees in the space of a few hours, and it kills. So be very, very careful. If you're using air conditioning, make sure you're around when it's there, so if something does fail, you can quickly do something to kind of help the rats. But yeah, that's one thing to understand. Other things to take advantage of, you can put rats in cooler areas. Make sure they're not in direct sun. It can be very, very tempting to take them out. It's a lovely day, let's take them outside. Direct sun is lethal. The rats are not kind of designed for it as such. In the wild they will generally stick around the shadows, it's sensible, or they'll be in burrows, etc. So they are not designed to be exposed to bright sunlight. They should always have shade. You can take them out a little bit, but you do need to bear in mind that direct sun is an absolute no, so keep them in somewhere shady. When it's really, really hot outside, don't take them outside, they're not going to appreciate it. But if it's nice and cool, let's say morning or evenings, you could think about that. Another point, opening windows. So I have a couple of windows I can open, one on the door here, one over there. If it's warmer outside than it is inside, close the windows. So during the day I would have all the windows closed. As soon as it got to evening and when it was cooler outside than it was inside, open all the windows, get the fan blowing cold air in from the outside, and leave it there open for quite a while until the temperature had cooled down, and then obviously I have to shut the door for security. But the little window here, open all the time. And actually most of the summer it's open all the time, up until the point where it is hot, and then the window's shut, because it's good for ventilation. There are cool areas in your house and warm areas in your house. If they're struggling, try and move them to one of the cooler rooms, if that's possible for you, and they are typically downstairs with no windows. It's one to think about for your own house too. Shut your curtains, that will stop the sun coming in as much, and that can be quite useful. I do have a little blind in that window which I'll typically shut if it's very, very hot, though actually I've got so much kind of Virginia creeper growing up out on the side of the garage that there isn't much sun that gets in that window. This one I can't do much about, but it's something that I might think about. You can get kind of reflective surfaces, and I might actually get one to stick in that window. But again, it's got a porch over it, so not a lot of direct sunlight falls on that window, why this makes quite a good rat room. But yes, so think about their environment and what you can do to keep the environment cool, and it's also the same as what you can do to keep your environment cool. But that's probably everything I can think on the subject of kind of heat loss today. There is probably other ideas, and there are many that support all these different like ways of losing heat or transferring heat. So I'd really welcome anybody to pop any ideas in the comments about what you do. The same if you want to pop on my Facebook page, you can put your own videos and photos up there as well, which would be absolutely great. Really look forward to seeing what you're doing. But just do think about it, do worry about it, but not excessively. Try and keep it kind of as stable as you can temperature wise for the rats. I will say I did get quite worried last week, which is why I was trying lots of different methods. But actually everybody was fine. I managed to keep it about 28, 29, and actually the temperature outside got up to, I think it was 34, 35 in this kind of area, which is northwest England, doesn't get as hot as other areas. I do know places that got to 38 in the UK, 40 probably in areas. I think my loft was about 40 something when I went up there to get the fan out. But yeah, so look after your rats. Hopefully we won't get another heat wave for a little while. I do prefer it to be a little bit cooler myself. I'm not good with the heat. But yes, make sure you enjoy it. I will say, encourage your rats to do things like pea fishing on free range. There's lots of fun ways you can make keeping cool, like fun for both of you actually. But yeah, enjoy it. Enjoy the sun, but enjoy it carefully, and make sure you think about your rats when it's warm. So bye from now.